The topic of this lecture is sameness and difference, and I want to start, somewhat unusually, with a criticism of the topic. Catherine McKinnon has criticized the sameness-difference question as the wrong question, saying that either way you answer it makes men the standard. Are women the same as men? Are women different from men? As she put it in her 1984 paper, Difference and Dominance, published in her 1987 book, Feminism Unmodified, approaching sex discrimination in this way, as if sex questions are difference questions and equality questions are sameness questions, provides two ways for the law to hold women to a male standard and call that sex equality. There are sex differences, so women are different to men, but crucially, men are different to women. It's only our sexist history that makes us take the male as the standard and the female as the departure. McKinnon says, why should you have to be the same as a man to get what a man gets simply because he is one? Why does maleness provide an original entitlement, not questioned on the basis of its gender, so that it is women who want to make a case of unequal treatment in a world men have made in their image, who have to show in effect that they are men in every relevant respect, unfortunately mistaken for women on the basis of an accident of birth. It's no solution to take women as they are as the standard and affirm that, which some difference feminists have done, because where this difference has been built by a history of male supremacy, that risks women affirming their own subordination. McKinnon writes, women value care because men have valued us according to the care we give them, and we could probably use some. Women think in relational terms because our existence is defined in relation to men. Further, when you are powerless, you don't just speak differently. A lot you don't speak. Your speech is not just differently articulated, it is silenced, eliminated, gone. You aren't just deprived of a language with which to articulate your distinctiveness, although you are deprived of a life out of which articulation might come. Not being heard is not just a function of lack of recognition, not just that no one knows how to listen to you, although it is that. It is also silence of the deep kind, the silence of being prevented from having anything to say. Sometimes it is permanent. All I'm saying is that the damage of sexism is real, and reifying that into differences is an insult to our possibilities. This is an important point. Powerlessness can be so destructive that it's not enough to simply make sure you are heard. What you might have said cannot be known because your powerlessness has destroyed your ability to even say or think it. McKinnon is saying that taking any of the effects of sexism on women and celebrating them as women's difference is insulting. She thinks we should move away from the sameness-difference approach and instead take a dominance approach. The dominance approach centers on abuses of women on the basis of sex. She points to the exploitation of women's work, the amount of rape, the amount of child abuse, the amount of domestic violence, prostitution and pornography, the latter an institution that makes sex inequality into sex to the tune of $8 billion a year in profits, largely to organized crime. This shift from sameness or difference to dominance sounds good, especially when it's focused on human rights abuses that we would object to for anyone that just happen to be done more to women and girls. But it sidesteps the hardest questions after that, for it is hard to conceptualize treating something in accordance with its nature as abuse. So there is really no getting out of answering the sameness-difference question. McKinnon might be right that by shifting to thinking about dominance, we can prevent the worst abuses against women, but in the end, we will still need to know whether women and men are the same or different so that we know whether differential treatment, unequal rights, is just or unjust. And that's why it's worth engaging seriously with those who defend difference. In part 1, we'll do a bit of myth busting to clear the ground for parts 2 and 3. In part 2, we'll look in detail at one particular theory in evolutionary psychology, and in part 3, we'll turn to the neuroscience of sex difference in order to try to get a grip on what is actually known about whether men and women are the same or different. Okay, part 1, myth busting. Myth number 1, that difference is science and sameness is ideology. Both in the popular culture and in some of the academic literature, there can be a sense that acknowledging difference is the scientific position and insisting upon sameness is the ideological position, specifically the feminist ideological position. And this is straightforwardly false. There are scientific-minded people on both sides, and there are ideologues on both sides. One can be just as dogmatic and politicized in insisting upon difference as upon refusing it. Let me give just one example to illustrate. David Buss and William von Hippel are both evolutionary psychologists. We'll talk more about Buss in part 2. In a paper they wrote together, published in 2018, they argued that there are 4 interlocking barriers standing in the way of research scientists who seek to understand human social psychology. Their justification for focusing on social psychology in particular, they explain in a footnote, was that their enterprise is closely aligned with that of evolutionary psychologists, yet they are often highly resistant to an evolutionary approach to human social functioning. The barriers, they said, were 1, being politically biased, so the discipline being left or liberal dominated. 2, holding a blank slate view of human nature. 3, tending to reject theories and evidence that contravene the blank slate, in particular evolutionary theories. And 4, evolved tendencies toward forming coalitions. These are very serious allegations that the discipline of social psychology as a whole is ideologically biased. Let's focus on their second and third claims about the blank slate view of human nature and what is done in order to protect it. Buss and von Hippel do not offer evidence in support of the claim that social psychologists have blank slate commitments. In the introduction to the paper, they simply assert that social psychologists adopt the blank slate view as most conducive to left/liberal ideology. So the thought is, because they are left-wing, they must be blank slaters. Later, they admit that few modern social psychologists would explicitly endorse the blank slate view of human nature. But then they say that nonetheless, it is endemic. They simply start referring to the dominant ideology of social psychologists and how this leads them to reject evidence that doesn't fit with it. For example, they write, some social psychologists reject empirical findings they believe to contravene their dominant ideology and their quest for social justice. And their examples are empirical findings about evolved gender differences and non-arbitrary standards of beauty. It is at this point in the paper that things get a little personal. The authors single out Cordelia Fine's book, Testosterone Rex, as an example of a social psychologist allegedly illustrating the distaste among psychologists for a possible role for sex hormones being the evidence allegedly rejected due to political ideology, commenting that journalists gave the book glowing reviews, while those with expertise in evolutionary biology gave it highly negative reviews. Just how unfair this is becomes immediately apparent when you learn that Fine's book won the Royal Society Insight Investment Science Book Prize in 2017, a £25,000 annual science book prize which was awarded in 2002 to Stephen Hawking. The authors write, misunderstandings of evolutionary psychology require a distortion of the facts to achieve political goals of equality. And they focus on Fine's criticism of the claim that testosterone leads people to seek sexual variety. At greater length, they say, the possibility that testosterone is part of an adaptation that creates an urge for sexual variety is clearly politically problematic for a variety of reasons, and thus is widely perceived by feminist scholars to be yet another case of evolutionary theories excusing men for behaving badly, because men have a great deal more circulating testosterone than women. They seem to claim to know the insides of social psychologists' minds. Despite the mountain of evidence, Fine and others have explicitly rejected the findings because they are perceived to interfere with the quest for gender equality. Note that because here, Moral and political commitments to the outcome of gender equality are taken to be the reason for rejecting the findings, even though Fine provided a book-length critique of the alleged evidence. And note too that mountains of evidence for sex difference cannot alone establish whether the sex difference in question is best explained by evolutionary psychology or by socialization or by some other thing entirely. None of this stops Buss and von Hippel from taking the moral high ground. They declare that rejection, meaning of evidence of evolved sex differences, based on the misperception that they interfere with ideological commitments, degrades the science and delays scientific progress. Only if Buss and von Hippel establish that social psychologists tend to hold a blank slate view, and that this is the reason why they reject purported evidence as to non-blank slate caused sex differences, could either of their second two barriers be established. And nothing Buss and von Hippel have said in the relevant sections of the paper establishes either claim. Cordelia Fine published a reply to their paper and defended herself and social psychology more generally, including by pointing out that Buss and von Hippel's own data didn't show what they said it showed. Fine says inspection of their data reveals not only a lack of support for their thesis that social psychologists hold blank slate views, but evidence against it. A majority of respondents to their survey said that it was highly likely Darwinian principles applied to humans. There was a more even spread of answers when it came to the question specifically about evolutionary psychology, but even there, a bare majority, 52.1%, said that it was more likely than not to be true that Darwin's ideas of evolution apply to the human mind, and that many of our social attitudes and preferences evolved across millions of years. And in response to their disparagement of her book, Fine writes that the author's brief portrayal leaves readers largely ignorant or misinformed regarding both my scientific views and the supporting evidence I presented. Where they say she rejected evidence because it gets in the way of gender equality, she in fact cited, considered, engaged with plenty of such evidence. She writes, Buss and von Hippel therefore presumably meant that I rejected their preferred interpretation of prior findings, although they offered neither their own interpretation nor mine. Buss and von Hippel have no grounds and have made no grounds for their serious and potentially professionally damaging accusation that she has privileged politics over science. Fine says that the general project of trying to better understand the causes of disagreement between evolutionary psychologists and social psychologists is an interesting one, but not with what appears to be Buss and von Hippel's background assumption that any disagreement is a matter of the bias of social psychologists. In this dispute, it appears that those defending difference, the evolutionary psychologists, are the ones ideologically biased against social psychologists or leftists more broadly, and those defending sameness, the feminist in this case, is the one with science on her side. Okay, myth number 2, that there is difference, and the question is what best explains it. One tempting way to approach the sameness difference question, and I will admit the way that I have approached it in the past, is to think that when we look out at the world, we observe difference, which sets us up to ask about the explanation of that difference. That is, we think we see that men are from Mars and women are from Venus, and then we want to know why. Are the evolutionary psychologists right that this is explained by some ancient adaptations and we'd have to fight against our natures to mask that difference? Or are the feminists right that this is explained by differential socialization and enculturation so that we could fairly easily eradicate difference by changing socialization? Is difference necessary or contingent? Is it hard to change or is it easy to change? But as we'll talk about much more in part 3, the starting point is false. There is not difference standing in need of explanation, setting us up for nature, nature via nurture, or nurture alone as possible answers. Rather, there is a huge amount of heterogeneity and overlap between men and women, alongside a widespread false belief that there is more categorical difference. For any specific trait that people tend to think of as male typical or female typical, there is this, a mostly overlapping bell curve. but people tend to believe that there is this, two entirely separate curves. So next time you hear someone talk about men being like this and women being like that, you might ask not only for what trait, but also how much overlap there is. And if it's tiny, you might also wonder out loud, what is the point of calling that a difference between men and women at all? Which takes us nicely to myth number 3. Myth number 3, that there are male and female brains. Simon Baron-Cohen is a psychologist at the University of Cambridge who published a book in 2003 called The Essential Difference, with a picture of a naked man and a naked woman on the cover, with the subtitle, Men, Women, and the Extreme Male Brain. Strong implication, that is to say, that there is an essential difference between men and women. Men are like this, women are like that. Chapters include the male and female brain, the female brain as empathizer, the evidence, the male brain as systemizer, the evidence, and evolution of the male and female brain. Baron-Cohen offers a theory of autism as an extreme male brain. The opening line of the first chapter states his subject matter, essential sex differences in the mind. 3 lines into the book, he presents his theory. The female brain is predominantly hardwired for empathy. The male brain is predominantly hardwired for understanding and building systems. An ordinary person encountering claims about the female brain and the male brain is likely to come to the view that there are 2 distinct brain types. Maybe this was just an early form of clickbait, because by page 2, the claim is explicitly tempered. In this book, I will consider the evidence that, on average, females spontaneously empathize to a greater degree than do males. Note that I am not talking about all females, just about the average female compared to the average male. And by page 5, we have 5 different brain types, more empathetic than systemizing, more systemizing than empathetic, balanced between systemizing and empathizing, extreme systemizing, this is the type he thinks is autistic, and extreme empathizing. And by page 8, we have a subsection titled, Your Sex Does Not Dictate Your Brain Type. That is, not all males have the male brain, and not all females have the female brain. His claim is only that more females have the female brain, and more males have the male brain. In a debate with Gina Rippon in 2019, Baron-Cohen put up a slide reporting on the percentage of males and females that have which of the 5 types of brain, which showed that around 40% of females have an empathizing dominant brain, and around 40% of males have a systemizing dominant brain, compared to around 25% of the other sex having those types, and around 30% of people had balanced brains. All of which is to say that, contrary to the title of Baron-Cohen's book, again, The Essential Difference, there is no essential difference between men's and women's brains. And despite the terms male brain and female brain that Baron-Cohen used early on, these days he's just labeling the 5 types, there are no male and female brains. There are males and females, and they have brains, but knowing the sex can't tell you the brain. I'll have much more to say about that general point in part 3. Okay, part 2, sexual strategies. In a special issue of the journal Sex Roles in 2011, a team of authors took up the empirical predictions made by an evolutionary psychology theory known as sexual strategies theory, or SST. In this part of the lecture, I'm going to focus on their paper, which both explains and tests SST. But if you'd like to read the target paper, it's the Buss and Schmitt paper, Sexual Strategies Theory and Evolutionary Perspective on Human Mating from 1993, which is listed in the video description. What the authors, William Pedersen and colleagues, do in this paper is set out 2 competing theories, one from evolutionary psychology and one not, and test their predictions to see which is the better fit with current human behavior. These are sexual strategies theory, that's the evolutionary psychology one, and attachment fertility theory. So let me first set these out, and then we'll have a look at the author's experiments and what they showed. Sexual strategies theory argues for evolved sex-distinct mating mechanisms, for example, preferences, for short-term and long-term mating, due to fundamental biologically based sex differences and minimal levels of parental investment. For example, physical limitations of pregnancy, labor, and nourishing young versus mere insemination. Attachment fertility theory argues that when the care of both parents increases the probability of offspring survival, males and females are apt to evolve much more homologous or similar mechanisms, impacting parental caregiving, pair bonding, and mate selection. This need for biparental care shifts the evolved pattern from sex distinct to sex homologous mate selection mechanisms. Okay, so to simplify, SST predicts men making a minimal investment in parenting, and AFT predicts men and women making similar investments in parenting, on the assumption that this improved infant survival in our history, which others have argued for, but I won't take up here. Now to the predictions of SST, and whether the empirical evidence supports those predictions or rather supports the rival theory, AFT. So let's start with their first study. One of the key ideas behind SST is that men and women make different proportional investments in offspring. Men need only to provide sperm, whereas women must provide the conditions for fertilization as well as gestation and lactation. Women are doing more than men. This yields a prediction. According to the earlier theory on which SST is based, if women or men invest more in offspring, women or men should be more picky in choosing a mate. That is, whichever sex invests more should be more picky because they have more to lose. And whichever sex invests less should be less picky because they have less to lose. In our species, men are assumed to be the less investing sex, so the prediction is that men's standards in picking a mate should be lower than women's, and men should devote a larger proportion of their total mating effort to short-term mating than do women. The second study. A related idea is that men and women face different reproductive opportunities and reproductive constraints, and this affects their respective approaches to short-term relationships. As Buss and Schmitt put it, historically, men appear to have achieved increases in the number of sexual partners, not through increases in the number of offspring per partner. SST seems then inconsistent with the possibility that men would avoid sex in short-term relationships compared to long-term relationships, and especially if pregnancy were likely. And probably because in long-term relationships, women would have men's support, but in short-term relationships not, women can be predicted to favor short-term matings likely to result in pregnancy less. Pedersen and colleagues formalized this reasoning into the hypothesis that sexual strategies theory would suggest that, given the relative benefits and costs, men would not be particularly likely to avoid having sex, and certainly would not be more likely to avoid short-term mating than long-term mating if pregnancy was likely. Attachment fertility theory, on the other hand, would make an entirely different prediction. I'll quote the authors at length on this point. AFT argues that biparental care, meaning care by both parents, was biologically, chemically, and psychologically adapted for in human evolution. Specifically, without biparental care, almost half of the children among hunter-gatherers do not survive childhood, and historically, childhood mortality without fathers may have been even higher. By definition, fathers are more likely to participate in caregiving in the context of long-term relationships. This, in turn, increases the likelihood of offspring survival. AFT would therefore predict that men would avoid having sex in a short-term relative to a long-term relationship if pregnancy were likely to occur. What would AFT predict for women? Among mammals, when fathers matter for offspring survival, evolved homologous, gender-similar mechanisms prevail. As such, AFT would predict that women would show the same pattern as men. In other words, more avoidance of sex in short-term relationships if sexual relations would likely result in pregnancy. Study 3. The next prediction relates to differences in men's versus women's desired number of sexual partners. The idea is that men are constrained in their reproductive success primarily by the number of fertile women they can inseminate. Thus, it should be that men want more partners than they can realistically expect to have. Pedersen and colleagues say The prediction of sexual strategies theory seems clear. The number of sexual partners desired by men will exceed the number they realistically expect, viz. They are sexually constrained. Furthermore, it seems reasonable that SST would predict a gender difference in constraint, with men perceiving themselves as more constrained than women. AFT, on the other hand, would predict that while we might expect variability within men in feeling more or less constrained in achieving the number of partners desired, neither men nor women should, on the average, feel particularly constrained. And study 4. Finally, the fourth prediction of SST is that men have lower standards than women in short-term compared to long-term sexual contexts. As Buss and Schmitt stated, across all desired attributes in potential short-term mates, men will impose less stringent standards than women impose. Again, AFT in comparison would predict similar patterns for both men and women. Okay, so we now have a sense of sexual strategies theory, that differences in reproductive biology mean different levels of investment for procreation, and so predict different behaviors in terms of solving the evolutionary problem of survival and reproduction. So men spend more of their time on short-term dating, will not avoid casual sex that might lead to pregnancy, will desire more partners, and will have lower standards than women. And we have a sense of the rival theory and its predictions, attachment fertility theory, which says that kids in our species survived better with fathers around, so men and women are going to be more or less the same when it comes to mating practices and preferences. The studies to test these hypotheses were all done on college students, with the authors explaining college students were the sample of interest here because college students were the sample of interest in the vast majority of empirical studies we reviewed, and also that mating goals are presumably active for this group. To test proportion of time spent on short-term versus long-term relationships, students were asked about the amount of time and money they spent on short-term, brief affairs or one-night stands, intermediate term, dating or going steady, and long-term relationships, potential marriage partners, in a typical week. They compared the short-term investments against the combined total investments to get the proportions. They found no significant differences between men and women, either for time or for money. This finding is inconsistent with SST and consistent with AFT. To test likelihood of avoiding casual sex that might result in pregnancy, they asked students to rate on a scale from very actively avoid to very actively seek the extent to which they would seek or avoid having sex if they knew that there was a high probability that having sex on that particular night would result in pregnancy. They found that men were more likely to avoid sex if pregnancy was likely in a short-term relationship than in a long-term relationship. This finding is inconsistent with SST but consistent with AFT. To test whether men desire more partners than they realistically expect to have, and more than females do, they asked students how many sexual partners they would ideally like to have over a series of different time periods, and also about how many they thought they could realistically have over those same time periods. The median response for both men and women was no difference between the number ideally desired and the number realistically expected. The authors say, consistent with our hypothesis and the expectations of attachment fertility theory, these findings suggest that both men and women, typically, are not constrained in achieving the number of partners they desire. These findings, however, do not support sexual strategies theory. Specifically, if men are not constrained in their reproductive success primarily by the number of fertile women they can inseminate, can there be evolutionarily based gender differences in the problems that follow from this non-constraint? Obviously not. They also note additional research that supports this finding. Most people want to settle down in a long-term, mutually exclusive sexual relationship. 98.9% of men and 99.2% of women. Most people don't want to be dating for more than 5 years before finding that partner, if they haven't already found them. Most people, both men and women, wanted 0 short-term partners. When they wanted anything other than the permanent long-term partner, it was an intermediate dating partner. The authors say, Taken together, these findings are consistent with the possibility that for most of our lives, after an initial promiscuous seeking and dating phase in the teens and 20s in the US, men and women would ideally prefer to focus on a long-term relationship that typically lasts for decades. Finally, to test whether men have lower standards than women in short-term interactions, students rated characteristics in a partner for both short-term and long-term relationships. Positive characteristics included good financial prospects, physically attractive, kind and understanding, sexually loyal, creative and artistic, exciting personality, likely to earn a lot of money, college graduate, good heredity, easygoing, likely to succeed professionally, intelligent, reliable future career, gives me gifts early on, good looking, sex appeal, healthy, good housekeeper, emotionally close, emotionally warm, honest, ambitious, able to protect me from physical harm, and athletic. Negative characteristics included prudish, financially unsupportive, low sex drive, unfaithful, promiscuous, sleeps around a lot, lacks ambition, uneducated, financially poor, stingy, emotionally cold, unemotional, and emotionally distant. And of course, they were looking at whether people chose different and less stringent characteristics for their short-term partners and whether there was a sex difference here. They found that both men and women lower their standards for short-term compared to long-term relationships. Men did not lower them more than women. So again, and for a fourth time, the predictions of SST were not borne out, and the predictions of AFT were. AFT claims that instead of distinct critical problems for men and women leading to sex-distinct evolved mating mechanisms, humans shared one of the most fundamental problems that shaped human evolution, the survival of extraordinarily dependent and vulnerable offspring. Such shared evolved problems for men and women were solved with evolved mechanisms that operated more similarly than differently for men and women. For example, pair bonding mechanisms, parental caregiving mechanisms. These evolved mechanisms afford the formation and maintenance in humans of long-term pair bonds that support survival of offspring so that offspring might themselves reproduce. Of course, where empirical experiments are concerned, one can always pick holes, but hopefully this at least gives you a good sense of a way to approach evolutionary psychological claims about sex difference. Okay, part 3, the neuroscience of sex difference. I mentioned in part 1 Simon Baron-Cohen's claim that there are male and female brains, and in part 2 we talked about one set of claims that evolutionary psychologists make about sex-differentiated psychologies. The general idea is that there are brain differences between the sexes that produce sex differences in personality profiles, behaviors, and interests. These are two distinct types of claim. One about brain structure, meaning the material stuff, and one about brain function, meaning what that material stuff causes in terms of what the people with the brains are like. In her book, Gender Mosaic, written to be accessible to a large popular audience, Daphna summarizes some of her scientific work in both of these areas. Let's start with brain structure. Yoel notes that belief in brain sex, that there are male brains and female brains, is still very popular, both with scientists and the general public. She says that a review paper published in 2014 reported 5,600 studies on sex differences in the volume and density of the brain in the past 25 years. There have been reports on differences in overall brain size, the size of specific regions of the brain, in neurotransmitter systems, in the structure of neurons, the density of receptors, and the molecules that the neurotransmitters bind themselves to. But these are all average differences. What that means is that there's a lot of overlap between women and men in any of these aspects of the brain, and some women will have one or more of the differences associated on average with men, and some men will have one or more of the differences associated on average with women. Size differences in regions are proportionate to the overall brain size, and once that is taken into account, some areas thought to be bigger in men actually become smaller, which is to say, in men, the regions are a smaller proportion of the total brain, even though they are larger on average than women's. In the chapter, The Differences Stack Up, Yoel notes how many studies have looked for brain differences between the sexes and not found them, and how this message can become skewed because it's not exciting for the media to report study finds no sex difference, while it is exciting to report the opposite. She gives an example. A study published in Nature, one of the top 2 science journals in the world, in 1995 reported that there were sex differences in a language processing task. The study got a lot of media attention, including in the New York Times, which ran a piece with the headline, "Men and Women Use Brain Differently, Study Discovers." But she points out that there's a failure of both the academics who wrote the paper and the media reporting. The academics scanned brain activity in women and men doing 3 different language-related tasks, one on letter recognition, one on grouping words by meaning, and one on rhyming. They found no sex differences for letter recognition and grouping words by meaning, but they did find a difference for rhyming, and they spent most of the paper talking about this rather than talking about all 3 studies equally. Then the media attention further exaggerated this issue. Later, new studies failed to show sex differences in language processing tasks, and a meta-study of 26 studies on language processing and sex published in 2008 reported that no sex difference could be established. Yoel ends that chapter by saying maybe there aren't sex differences in the way we have thought, where men and women process tasks in a very different way, for example, using different parts of the brain. But still, there could be small differences in very specific tasks that nonetheless add up to a sex difference of the kind we would find interesting and significant. So that became the thing she wanted to work to establish. She asks at the end of the next chapter, do brains come in 2 forms, female and male? To answer this question, we need to determine whether the various sex differences in the brain, whatever their source, and here she means whether they are a product of nature or are created by nurture, meaning that the person's habits and behaviors create certain differences in the brain, as stress, drug addiction, and some types of repetitive behavior do, add up consistently to form 2 distinct brain types, female and male. An even broader question is whether sex differences in psychological characteristics add up to create 2 types of humans. The heart of her book is the collection of short chapters in Part 2, The Human Mosaic. In Chapter 7, Mosaic of the Human Brain, Yoel describes her hypothesis that we all have a mix of features that tend to be described as male or female, or associated with males or females. She determined to identify the collection of brain features that shows the largest difference between men and women, and then try to find out how often the brain of a particular individual turned out to have consistently male or consistently female features, meaning the ones more common in males or more common in females. Yoel and her colleagues started with brain scans from 281 Israeli women and men. They found that for brain volume, the overlap between men's and women's brains was so great that they couldn't define a female volume and a male volume. So what she and her team did is give the brains scores on their various features, and then scores that were more common in women than men were called female end, scores that were more common in men than women were called male end, and scores that appeared with similar frequency in women and men were called intermediate. This graph gives an example of this. It reports grey matter volume in the left hippocampus, with the light grey being men and the dark grey being women. Women have a higher volume than men, so the range of scores for the top 1/3 of women are then coded as the female end, and the range of scores for the bottom 1/3 of the men are coded as the male end, with the middle third being intermediate. This is a way of tracking the extremes of the sex differences and coming up with a way of then asking for a random individual, does her grey matter volume in the left hippocampus fall in the male end range of scores, the female end range of scores, or in the intermediate range? With this strategy, Yoel and colleagues could take as many of the brain features that showed a sex difference as you like, and then work out for any individual woman whether all, most, some of her specific brain features tended to be female end, and whether this was true for women in general and men in general with the features coded as male end. They chose 10 regions to test, the ones with the largest differences as identified in previous work, and they didn't worry about whether these differences were more plausibly a matter of nature or of nurture. Here's the results in her own words. Having seen how the female and male features were mixed up in the brains of rats, I had expected that at least some of the human brains would be mosaics of female end and male end regions. But when we were done analyzing the data in humans, the results exceeded all my expectations. A mere 7 of the 281 brains, about 2%, had only female end or only male end scores. Another 4% or so had only intermediate scores. The rest were mixtures of intermediate, female end, and male end features. Each brain had its own unique mixture, but most amazingly, about a third of the brains had features on both extremes, the female end and the male end. That is, they had extreme scores appropriate for their own sex on some of the features, but at least one score highly inappropriate for their sex. Okay, so this is a preliminary confirmation of the mosaic brain hypothesis, which is that there are no male and female brains. Rather, there are brains that have unique combinations of traits that we have associated culturally with males and females, and which are on average more common in males than females, or vice versa. But that's just one pool of brain scans. So she then describes a further study on more brain scans, this time with 1,400 brains in total, from 3 separate data sets. And she says they found the same thing, a small number of brains with only male end or only female end features, between 1 to 8% depending on the data set. Those who had a mixture of brain features were between 23 to 53% of the brains, depending on the data set. In this group, some women had more male end than female end brain features, and some men had more female end than male end features. They also put the familiar claim about men's and women's brains being wired differently to the test. This claim is about the connections between and within the two brain hemispheres, with the received wisdom being that men on average have stronger connections within each hemisphere, and women on average have stronger connections between the two hemispheres. And some researchers then conclude from that it's an explanation of why men are better at perception and coordinated action, and women are better at social skills, memory, and multitasking. Yoel says her team looked at more than 4,000 connections in the brain and looked at whether those differences add up consistently to a sex difference between men and women. They chose 7 of the connections that showed the biggest sex difference in previous research. Again, here's the conclusion in her words. Practically all the brains proved to be patchworks in terms of the strength of their connections. In a tiny fraction of the cases, 0.7%, all 7 connections were of an intermediate strength. But we did not find a single person in whom the 7 were all female end or all male end. On the other hand, the number of brains containing connections on both extremes was very high, 48% of the entire lot. Because of this mix, it was impossible to talk about 2 types of connectivity, one typical of females, the other typical of males. So, Yoel and her team are not denying that there are average differences between men and women in some features of brain structure. They are denying that there is a male brain and a female brain. Males have brains and females have brains, obviously, but it is simply false that the features more common in male brains show up consistently in males or add up to a male brain sex type. Most brains are mixtures of the male and female associated types and have intermediate type traits too. Here's an interesting upshot. A scientist can be given a random brain and say what the sex of the person is most likely to be in the sense of their reproductive role, male or female. But a scientist cannot be given a male or female person and give any accurate prediction of what the combination of their brain features is likely to be. And this might be one source of confusion when people talk about brain sex differences. If male brains are on average larger, then it might be possible to guess that a large brain belonged to a male. That's fine. But if it isn't possible to be given a male and then be able to articulate what his brain is like, then we haven't remotely vindicated the idea that there are male and female brains, at least not in the way that these are popularly believed in. Okay, so far we've been talking about brain structure. The other thing I wanted to talk about from the book is about brain function, meaning what the brain might be thought to cause in terms of things like personality and behavior. Although note that this claim about causation is complicated, because there can be all sorts of mediating mechanisms in between, not least one's environment. In chapter 13, Mosaic of the Mind, Yoel turns to this question of brain function. She takes the same strategy of wanting to know whether average sex differences add up in men and women to create two types of persons. But this time the lists of features are psychological characteristics and behaviors. Again, they didn't bother about whether these traits were more plausibly created by nature or by nurture. They just looked for the largest sex differences in personality or behavior as identified by previous research, and worked on the basis of those. They found that average differences were small. In one dataset of 7,000 Americans, they found nothing they could use because, in her words, on all but one of the 56 variables in the survey, the differences between men and women were non-existent, or so small that defining female end and male end scores would have made no sense. Eventually, they found 3 datasets they could use, covering 5,500 American young people, and they took the same strategy of classifying female end, male end, and intermediate values. An example of some of the traits is self-esteem, worries about weight, and communication with their mother. Yoel says, there wasn't even a single person who had only feminine or only masculine scores, whereas 59% of the youth had both feminine and masculine characteristics. This table from the front end papers helps to show both the average differences point, that there is more pink in the women's tables and more blue in the men's, which are the colors used for female end and male end traits respectively. But each person, represented by a single line, has a mixture of those colors and traits. And it's completely different features that vary in each individual. They found the same thing for a dataset of 4,860 adolescents, with traits including depression, perceived weight, delinquency, impulsivity, gambling, involvement in housework, engagement in sports, and a femininity score previously developed by another psychologist. 70% of the adolescents had both female end and male end features. The hypothesis of the mosaic is true of the brain, whether we're talking about the formal properties involved in brain structure or the more social properties involved in brain function. There are not two types of brains, male and female. There are brains that have mixtures of more male typical and more female typical features, and almost no one has just a big stack of the one type. This is the point from myth 2 in part 1. The myth being that there is psychological sex difference, and the question is only what explains it. There is not the difference that has been taken to be in need of explanation in the first place. Okay, before we finish, let me mention a couple of useful resources on this topic. First, there is the website sexdifference.org, where you can generate the overlapping bell curves to visualize the sex difference reported in any scientific paper. Second, there is Yoel's website for the mosaic brain, where you can enter your own characteristics and generate your personalized brain mosaic. And finally, I recommend the debate between Gina Rippon and Simon Baron-Cohen that I mentioned in part 1, which covers some of the same themes we've been talking about here, but has a lot more interesting detail and zeroes in on their precise disagreement over psychological sex difference. See you next week to talk about sexism against men.